Let's give Mr. Cole a hand.
Well, first off, just want to thank you all for having us tonight. I think Matt and I are going to be doing this quite a bit over the next weeks and months ahead as we continue to consider what we're calling the potential future for Santa Clarita Valley water governance, and that's I guess a big title for what we're trying to consider, and I think the purpose of tonight is to learn a little bit more about what that means, and also give an opportunity for you guys to give feedback to both Matt and I, and we can give that to our boards as well. Tonight, as Matt said, we're going to just go through kind of a little tag team presentation here, talk a little bit about the past, because I think it frames the discussion looking at the future. We'll get into the present a little bit, and then we will try to plot a little bit of direction for the future. And this is, as you'll see, an evolving process. Just to frame the discussion a little bit, this is a map of the service areas in the valley. What's reflected on here is Newhall County Water District in the green. You can see Santa Clarita Water Division, we call it kind of pink. Valencia Water Company red, and then LA County Water Works districts in the purple. And then what you see in the black around the edge of that is the Castaic Lake Water Agency boundary. So hopefully that gives you an idea of the different agencies involved in the discussions as we move forward. We're just a little bit about the past. We've had what some would consider a challenging past, but I think generally the water agencies in this valley have been collaborative, and that's reflected in the documents that we produce and the resources that we manage. The Urban Water Management Plan is a collaborative document between all the water agencies in the valley. We do, I think, a great job working in managing the groundwater basin. We've done that historically. But that being said, there are challenges, and one of those is just, from a water service standpoint, the complicated system in which we have to do that. And I mean that both from a state perspective and a local perspective. The challenges that we all as water agency managers are facing now are really dynamic. It's a changing environment. This year, last few years with the drought is an example of that. And then you focus in on that, what that means locally in the challenges that we face. We've had disagreements, quite a few recently over the past several years. We've had lawsuits between the agencies, specifically our agency, Newhall County Water District, and Castaic Lake Water Agency, over various things. It could be wholesale water rate, purchases of water companies, and things of that nature. So we've been trying to come to terms with what that means as far as water supply and reliability in the valley and service. Governance, again, both at the state level and locally, there's many layers of government that we have to deal with as water agencies. I think when you look at locally, you've got the water purveyors, the wholesaler, the city and county now through flood control and stormwater management are entering into the water resource picture. And more importantly than probably a lot of them, the sanitation district and how water is going to be reused in this valley is really starting to become at the forefront of governance that we're all dealing with as far as how we manage the resources. I put up here exploring an idea. This is really where we start transitioning into what we're going to talk about tonight. And it's really an outgrowth of the challenge over the lawsuits. It's been over a year ago now. I think both boards got to the point where they were tired of beating each other up, frankly, through the legal system. And out of that grew what was an ad hoc committee of both boards that tried to sit down, and they hired a professional mediator and tried to really start working on a way to settle things and move forward in a more constructive environment. And, looking at things like, is there a way that we can look at the best ideas and strengths of all the providers and move those forward? Is there a way that we can look at governance in the valley differently than we historically have? Is there a way to do this where you could gain efficiencies, possibly stabilize rates? That's an interesting statement in general, as all of us have experienced increasing water rates over the last several years. Focus more on the collaboration and the success rather than the conflict. And that ad hoc worked for several months. And a lot of it, I think, was contentious because we had been used to fighting so much. And I think what came out of it is that we ended up having more in common than we had in differences. And that's where these kind of ideas and policies are coming forth and ruminating out of. What the ad hocs decided straight away was that there needed to be a public engagement process, and so that's what you're seeing. You'll see us talk about that tonight and what it means going forward. They talked about having kind of a workshop environment so that the public could weigh in. We have set that up and started to conducting those to be able to get priorities from the community and what's important to the community and be able to incorporate that into any kind of policy development that would move forward. And just provide a venue for public information so that we can have a robust discussion about the possibility of a new governance structure in the Valley. The first workshop was, we'll call it Listen and Learn. There's a lot of spirited comments that came from that. But generally speaking, people wanted transparency. They wanted open, accessible information. There were concerns with change to service, how it would actually, if we change the way we do things, how it can impact how water service is handled in the Valley. And there was a considerable amount of people that also wanted to know, is there efficiencies that can be gained through this, and that we need to discuss those and evaluate those as we go forward. As far as the transparency and openness, I think what we've really tried to do is through this series of workshops. We've held another one in April that Matt will talk a little bit about the results from. We're planning on doing another one in May to kind of really drill in on finances and service, and then one in June to go over governance and potential governance options. We also, after that meeting, decided to engage LAVCO. The Local Area Formation Commission is what that stands for. They are the agency that the state has basically created to manage service providers. And so we felt that arena would provide, and they're local. This is a county organization that does this. So they're accessible and local to the community. And then we've launched what we're calling a listening tour, and I think that really is what we're here to do tonight is listen and gather information as we move forward. Concerns with service, again, we're trying to address that through a LAVCO process. They have things that are called municipal service reviews. Not sure if that's going to be the full process that ends up happening, but there's going to be an analysis of what we're considering and that would analyze the level of services to make sure there's not an impact about what we're considering. Study efficiencies. We're looking at engaging a financial expert. Hopefully that some of that information will be presented at the next workshop, so you can get an idea of what we're looking at and from that perspective. And then there was an issue raised, just the time of meeting we had. That first one was a little early for everybody, and so we've adjusted that, and we actually adjusted the meeting location. We're meeting at City Hall now to just provide everybody in the community an easier venue to get to. So I mentioned we did a second workshop already now, and it was really to dive deeper into the LAVCO process. We had the executive director of LAVCO come out and present how they go about things and the types of things they look at. And then we also had a kind of a breakout session where we got to just interact one-on-one with the people that came to that meeting and learn a little bit about the priorities, and then a question and answer session. And I'll go ahead and pass it over to Matt now, and he can kind of walk through that, and then we'll end up talking a little bit more about future.
Arrow keys, is that what it is? All right, thanks. Can you hear me okay? I'm a little bit taller than your average speaker sometimes. Okay, as long as you, I just want to make sure, yeah. So, as we said, we kind of, in that second workshop, we had an interactive process for part of it, where we had stations on the different subject areas, and we had a time for kind of direct Q&A one-on-one with members of the public, as well as cards that were available for people to check their priorities. And we've taken a look at those cards. I mean, certainly not a scientific survey. It's a survey of who was there and who filled out a card, but we did get pretty good participation on that. And on the governance card, two things came out. One was there was a lot of support for the idea of whatever this new entity might be, that it needs to have directly elected representation. That was something that came out both in this format and in another format that I'll get to in a minute. I think when asked about what type of governance, we offered a choice of at-large, by district, or hybrid, and by district was the clear preference of those who were there that night. We also asked about service priorities with regards to resource management and similar issues, and we had a pretty good sample of different ideas, including conservation. I think the top two were a support for regional projects, for example, a regional recycled water project, and then support for sustainable groundwater management. And as I recall, I think conservation and a conservation ethic was probably the third place item. So that gives us a little bit of an indication of maybe what the folks who came to the workshop had on their mind for what would be a good focus area. In terms of financial and ratepayer related issues, and these came out of partly the discussions themselves. Some of these issues came up in the discussion, so we thought it was a good idea to kind of put those out and see what people thought about them. One of the principles that's kind of been embedded in the discussions between the two ad hoc committees is keeping debts and liabilities separate. So the idea that you're not going into the marriage and taking on the debt of the other party. Will certainly benefit from future savings collectively, but those would be kept separate to protect any of the ratepayers. And Newhall happens to have a lower debt profile at this point in time, so that's something that they were very concerned about, and I think our board understood. And it also scored highest of those who were there attending that night as well. A couple other things that have been talked about in the ad hoc process is trying to look at each agency's budget process. Newhall's, Castaic's, Santa Clarita Water Division, and figure out how to make it as open as possible going forward. So Newhall has a model that they wanted us to consider, and I think there's agreement on the idea of a very open budget process and trying to make that as open as possible. The idea of an independent ratepayer advocate that would be able to evaluate and advise the board on matters relating to budget and rates. And then a question was asked whether to keep the separate rate structures or to go to a common rate structure, or to phase into a common rate structure over time. And the phase-in concept garnered the most support from those in attendance that evening. We also asked about what type of rates, because we do have, among the retailers in the valley, we actually have 3 different rate structures being used. And the preference from those in attendance was leaning towards non-tiered rates, which I believe Newhall has. The other agencies have some form of tiered or budget tiered rates at present date. So we will also consider that, I think, going forward, and how to go about doing that. In addition to what we garnered in the workshop, the ad hoc committee and the 2 boards were interested in knowing what the general public thought about this idea and try to get a sense of it early on. And that would do a couple things. One, it would help determine whether it was just had no legs, wasn't an idea that was worth investing a lot of time in. The second thing is perhaps identify if any of the concerns that the committee had already identified resonated with the public, and what other kinds of issues resonated with the public. You can read the whole survey. It's on the yourscvwater.com webpage, and we'll have that address up at the end of this presentation. So we've put it up there for everybody to read through. And I think I'll just kind of hit a couple of things. Typically, a survey like that will ask, what's the most important thing? It's an open-ended question. What's on your mind? What's the important issue in the community? And at different times, it'll be the economy or crime or traffic. In this case, it was water, and I think a lot of that had to do with the drought that we've been in and unprecedented actions by the state in requiring every community in the state to cut back. That's never happened in California before. And so we've all been through that together, and we still have that on us for now. We also asked what residents thought about their current local water provider. We wanted to kind of get a baseline of, well, what do people like about their current service? And with the idea, if you're going to bring the best elements in, you want to know what those things are. So there were generally favorable ratings of all the water providers in the valley. There was a little variation, but not too much, and I would say a lot of that has to do with just the bottom line cost and the rates. And it could also be individual experiences with service and that type of thing. But none of the ratings were below expectations. And I think most of the positive comments were just what you'd expect. I haven't had a problem. You know, everything works fine, or if I had a problem, it was resolved quickly. Those were a couple of the prevalent favorable rating reasons that were given. There was also, I think, in the context of the drought, and a couple of purveyors, the recognition that they were doing a lot to try to encourage conservation and equity among people who were being asked to conserve. And so that made the radar screen. And again, you can kind of look through some of that. In terms of the general idea of the proposed merger and how people reacted, we asked 2 times. We asked once before giving any information about the proposal at all. So just to get a cold read, what was the, you know, if I just lay it on you with no background, what's the, what's the response? And that was 49% in favor, 16% opposed, and 35% unsure, essentially wanting to have more information about it. We then asked towards the end of the survey, after more information was provided and some of the aspects of the proposed new agency formation concept were discussed, and that raised to a 61.7% favorable, 25% opposed. So people in the undecided were choosing which way they wanted to go on that, and 13% unsure at that point. As far as things that we took note of also in the survey, I think that were important, we asked what attributes would be most favorable for people to be willing to consider such a proposal. And polling at 78% was combining the best elements of the different parties in the new agency. So again, I think it's a high-level concept. The challenge will be how do we do that, and how do we make sure we're identifying those best parts. 76% felt they could support it with a directly elected board. So that was when singled out as an issue, that polled very favorably. And again, I think that's representative of our society. We like to have a say in things and have the ability to vote for the people that are going to watch whatever it is, whether it's a library or a water agency. A couple other things I would note. When we asked kind of as a blanket, list all the issues that you think would be important should one of these proposals go forward. And when you asked kind of the menu question, the things that you got polling over 60% in terms of importance, 60% of the people identified fair rates, ratepayer protections, and transparency. So some of those were above 60, but they were all at least 60. And then all at least 50% were directly elected representation, better coordination of water resource management, and streamlined operations of the entity. None of those things are really that surprising. I think those are kind of inherent in the concepts. And again, I think the challenge would be, if we do go forward, making sure that we can deliver on that and that the public is confident that we can. Going on to opportunities and challenges. So I think it's important to acknowledge this isn't a straightforward process. I think the two agencies are still discussing this. There are some thorny issues left to work through. Transitional issues are a big piece of that. I think how do you get the best elements? I think hearing what people value is really important for us in that process. What specifically is it that is a value from your relationship with your purveyor that should continue going forward, and what can we learn from that? In terms of choice and governance, I think there is a discussion about how do you do a couple things. You need to retain the elected board members from each entity. So I think the goal is not to unseat anybody. They've all been elected from their respective constituents. And then over time, the question is, what's the right size for a board? So 15 would be the initial board size in combining the two. Currently, CLWA has 11 and Newhall has 5, but one of the CLWA directors is actually appointed by the Newhall board and is a Newhall director. So when you combine that, you would have 15. And then I think also wrestling with the Voting Rights Act and setting up electoral districts so that we have representation throughout the community, and probably moving away from at-large type seating or elections. Those are things that, again, I think we're trying to gauge the public interest in that and come up with a proposal or proposals that strike a balance on those issues. I've heard board sizes bandied about between 9 and 13 ultimately, and obviously the bigger the board is, the more opportunity there is for participation and membership in the board and getting elected, and the smaller, perhaps a little bit more manageable, but I think in that range, it's probably just comes down to what's going to work best with setting up the electoral divisions and the representation, if it went that far. In cost efficiencies and cost effectiveness, I think Steve and I have talked a lot about this. This is probably the one where it kind of falls on us more to figure that out and to work with a consultant to try to get insight on that. And there seems to be a scale benefit that would occur, particularly for Newhall. It's hard to do all the same things with 9,700 or 10,000 service connections that an entity can do with 30,000 connections when you compare Newhall and Santa Clarita, for example. the employee per connection count is different because you have to have some of those same basic things. At the same time, we want to make sure that scaling takes into account the practicalities of future service. I think there are potentially opportunities with facilities and cost savings there. Large, heavy fleet that would not be duplicated between the two entities. We're looking for as many of those potential benefits as we can, and then hopefully emerge with a plan that makes sense from that standpoint. And then ending conflict and litigation. And I guess I would say, I'll admit this is probably a little bit of a public relations sentence here. I think anybody who lives in America knows that conflict is part of who we are. So I would say it's changing the venue for the conflict and creating a venue that does have a valley-wide footprint, but representation from different areas of the valley with elected board members who can bring those concerns to the same table, and an organization that is responsive to the policy direction of that new governing structure. So that, to me, is where the potential is in this. And I'll talk a little bit more why I think that's a good thing, potentially. So yes, it's a larger district. It's larger. You can look at it either as it's larger by the size of Newhall, or it's larger by the size of Castaic, I guess. The sum of the parts is somewhat larger. Is it DWP? No, it's not LADWP. LADWP has 674,000 service connections. This new entity would have less than a tenth of that. LADWP has 3.9 million people. I hope we'll never have 3.9 million people, or even perhaps maybe a tenth of that. But so no, they're not. The other big difference is GWP doesn't have an elected board. It has an appointed board of water commissioners, and they're political appointees. I don't want to drag GWP under the bus. They can probably do that all right on their own, but I think there's a difference, and I understand the concern of the DWP argument that we don't want to create anything that's even close to being non-responsive or develops an infrastructure deficit to the degree DWP did. I think this agency has to take care of the infrastructure in the valley and not let it decay and erode over time. And I think part of DWP's problem over the years has been political pressure on their rates and the city siphoning off revenue, quite frankly. And we don't want to create either one of those situations. So I think the other one is the larger board, and is that unwieldy? I've kind of spoken to that a little bit already. So what's the right size for that board? That's one of the challenges. And then I think status quo works, and I would say, yeah, I don't think either board wants to go forward with something that they would think is worse than the status quo, clearly. And I think Newhall's made that extremely clear in that discussion, and that's why one of the reasons it took a long time, and I think it took a long time to a good end, that there were a lot of protections and things identified in that discussion that could be built into a new agency. But I'll say also that change works too. And as this valley has grown, for better or worse, and I came from Temecula, which has had a very similar trajectory in terms of growth from a more of an outlying semi-rural community. And they've had to wrestle with their governance and service issues over that time period too. And the district I worked for had a consolidation in the 1970s, actually, as that area began to grow. The status quo does work, but we think we're going to try to find something here that works better, and it works better for the future issues that we're facing. So as the state has evolved in terms of water policy from almost a hands-off, plug into the state project and take your water, what about those fish in the Delta, to having to operate the entire state water project around the fish in the Delta, losing, this year we've lost 1 million acre-feet of water to the operating restrictions, and that's the reality that we all work with. The solutions offered by the state have been to push everyone towards watershed level planning, regional self-reliance, or greater regional self-reliance. Most recently, I think the state's taken on the issue of groundwater overdraft and passed statewide legislation requiring every groundwater basin to come up with a regional governance structure. This in lieu of the state operating the groundwater basin. So there are things that have been pushing us in this direction for a while, and I think certainly you can make the argument that we could do this under the status quo. We simply would continue to try or do our best to cooperate as agencies. I think you can also make the argument that it's time we took another step and had a regional forum where these issues can be brokered and everybody has a seat at the table. So I would say, where are we now and why move forward? Well, I think it's an idea worth exploring, and again, I want to be clear, I don't think either board is locked into this. They're going to have a decision coming up a little later this summer on whether to go the next step and take this through LAFCO or not. And then they're going to have to decide whether they want to complete the LAFCO process as that goes on. But there is this opportunity. We don't get this kind of opportunity all that often. I'd much rather be doing this in an environment where both parties are at the table and negotiating freely than some kind of hostile thing or some state-imposed regional water governance mandate. Who knows, that might be the next great idea to come out of Sacramento. I'd rather do this under our own head of steam and see if we can't get it done the right way, and through that gain some efficiencies, and some of the benefits we think would be to also stabilize rates as we can realize those efficiencies going forward. Public process, as Steve has outlined, we've done 2 public workshops. We have 2 more scheduled, one in May and one in June. And the magic of that scheduling, I will confess an insider piece of information, those were the 2 dates that City Hall was available in May and June. So we did our best. We wanted to space them out about a month apart and give people time to digest and give ourselves time to hopefully have meaty material ready. There are direct communications. If you go to the yourscwater.com website, we have tried to create a repository of the different information that's being developed as we go through this process. You can find the survey there. You can find a lot of the other written materials there. I think we have video from workshop number 2, which I did not want to look at because I hate seeing myself on video. And ultimately, I think the current thinking is when we're done with those workshops in May and June, we would get to the point where there's probably going to be 1 or more joint board meetings to discuss whether it's time to go forward to LAFCO and file an application. We're also kind of parallel with that. We're available to come out to HOAs, business groups, nonprofits, individuals, anybody that wants to meet with us and get this information or ask questions or share their input. We certainly are willing to do that. And as far as what's on the horizon, I kind of just covered that. Sorry, I'm a really bad PowerPoint follower sometimes. But if we go through the LAFCO process, that would initiate in the summer of 2016 at the earliest. And a little bit about that process. Their terminology is you sort of initiate an application, but the application isn't considered complete until everything is done. So we would start with resolutions of intent that each board would need to pass and submit indicating our intent to do that to LAFCO. They then start some of the administrative work that takes months to look at the tax rate areas and all of the kind of nuts and bolts part of changing a governance boundary. And we would be completing work that's needed for their assessment of, I think there's like 16 or 17 issues that they evaluate for a proposal like this, and it was in Paul's PowerPoint presentation, a list of those 17 factors. And they have to develop a staff report to the board of LAFCO. So we would anticipate a completed application sometime in the winter of 2016-17. That could either be late this year or early next year. LAFCO holds a public hearing and then determines what action, if any, to take. And that's up to the LAFCO Commission, whether they vote that up or down or refer it back to staff for more work or refer it back to the agencies for refinement. I've seen different things happen in that process over time at different LAFCOs. And we anticipate, because CLWA is a special act agency of the legislature, we would need legislation to further clean up the implementation of the LAFCO action, and that would be slated for the 2017 session. Alan wanted me to talk about the urban water management plan, but I'm going to check on time. Do you want me to still talk about this? I only have one slide. One slide. Okay, and I appreciate that he was thinking of everybody in asking that we talk about this. These are prepared every 5 years for the state. They're submitted to the Department of Water Resources. They're also a great planning vehicle for the region. Every water provider in the state is required to do that. We examine projected water demand, and that's tied to land use planning. And this time we've tied it to the OV plan, which we now have. And then looking at our available projected supply in different weather scenarios, normal years, single dry year, multiple dry years, to see how we stack up. And that looks out into the future as far as 2050. We started preparation in the fall of 2015. We've had 3 public meetings that have been attended. I see some of the people who attended those meetings are here tonight. We had our first public hearing on that last week on the 13th. A public draft is out there and it's available. The easiest way to get it is digitally on the clwa.org website. Comments on that report are due on May 17th, and we certainly have gotten many comments already, but there's still time to comment if you wish. And then we will have a final public hearing on June 8th at our offices at 6:15 p.m. and get the plan adopted and turned in on time to the state. So thanks for that. I think that's all. Yes, and there's the website, yourscbwater.com. Thanks.